Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video I wanted to give a guide to my DPS calculation sheets, as I've been using them more and more in videos lately, and also it's a very requested thing of me, as they aren't fully intuitive, especially if you aren't well aware of how the damage calculation in Division 2 works. So in today's video I'm going to basically show you by example how to use them, and that they are basically fully a calculation sheet. You don't have to do much math or something for them. You just fill them in and you get numbers out of them. And the numbers that you will get out of them are burst and sustain DPS. And what also this video isn't, as I want to outline that, is this isn't about burst DPS or sustain DPS on its own, as that's a very long subject on its own and will be a subject of a future video. And what it also isn't is the damage calculation of the game. I'm just going to show you how to fill in these sheets and do that by example. And the example I'm going to use today specifically is that in the recent Obliterate Striker showcase that I did, I was talking about how I was using FAMAS with grade 21 and that added 9 point something percent to my final output. And I basically want to show you how we calculate those things. How do we know how much grades and such add? Now in this case, that grade 21 FAMAS is currently now a grade 22 FAMAS, as the new season has of course come out. And yes, my FAMAS is always going to go up to the max. And also we're basically going to shortly discuss, was this a good choice? And spoiler warning, no, but you have to bling out something in your life. But we're just basically going to go through the full calculation and I'm going to show by example, basically. It's going to be split into two chapters, as we're going to discuss two different calculation sheets, and that's going to be this Multicalc and this DPS Calc with talents, and that's specifically weapon talents. As I feel that if I especially explain the Multicalc one well, then you will have all of the knowledge required to use the other ones, especially in this case, this quick calculator. This other Multicalc is the older variant. This newer variant has one addition, but this older one is linked in several places, so I wanted to keep it as it was. But basically the new Multicalc is just the old one, but better. So we're going to start using that, as it's a pretty recent addition as well to this folder. Speaking of this folder, this is, I will provide the links, of course, to all of these, and you have access to this folder with the link itself, but of course you can't fill them in here, as that would be quite a hassle. But what you can do from here is actually, if you are logged into your browser, in the browser that you're viewing them in, into Google, and you have a Google Drive, you can copy them over to your own Google Drive. So you right-click them and you copy to drive, or you open them and in the file you select copy to drive. There's plenty of places where it does it. And what you can also do, you can download them, and I believe they work. I have been told they work fine in Excel and LibreOffice. So I have not tested that myself, but they're simple spreadsheets, so they should work. And yes, we're going to discuss each one separately, but both of them basically work in the same way. But I just want to touch on both of them. To actually jump into the multi-calculator, to outline what this does is, this is basically to compare up to 10 builds. So you have 10 rows here that can give you data. And those 10 rows derive their data from all of these yellow fields on the bottom here. So each row per row is linked to up here. And it's done in this way with up-down, basically, as otherwise it would be in a very long line. And that would actually, this has better legibility than that way. In the upper left, all of this gray area up here with different values of gray, is where your output is going to be, and especially we're going to concern ourselves with burst DPS and sustain DPS, as that is the numbers that we care about once we fill in these kinds of spreadsheets. And we get percentages, and all of these percentages are versus the build in the top row. So that is important to know. So all of them compare to whatever you have at the top. As that is, usually the easiest way to compare stuff. And you don't have to go up to 10. You can even compare 1, or you can just even fill in for 1 build if you just want to know the burst and sustain of it. But what this sheet, of course, doesn't do is include weapon talents. You could add them in manually, so to say, but that's not really recommended. You can use the weapon talent one, as that is much easier. In the upper right here is the new section that I briefly talked about that is added to this new multicalc, and that is a checking tool, basically. You can see here it's columns for each of the rows of those builds, and here it will spit out numbers, prediction numbers, basically given from your stats, to what the body shot number is going to be, the body shot plus crit number, the headshot number, and the headshot plus crit number. And these should match in-game. If these do not match in-game, something somewhere has gone wrong. You will always have a little bit of rounding issues, as the game rounds a little bit differently than the rest of the universe, basically. But if your number is basically off more than 3, then you're basically something has gone wrong. And usually if you're missing one of the stats, you'll be off by several thousands. So it's an easy checking tool, and I will show as well how that works as well in the game. So then we have all of this yellow section, and this yellow section is basically where input happens. You can input stuff in there. You don't specifically have to. For instance, if you don't want to include headshot in your calculation, you just leave the headshot slot empty. Any empty slot basically counts as 0. And especially in our case, for instance, we have 1 amp that's going to be active. We don't have other amps, and in that case, you just leave those empty. What you cannot leave empty is actually these sections in the top, which is the RPM max size and base reload, and that's from just the weapon stats. And down here is where we have a section that we can use to calculate base weapon damage. And base weapon damage is the stats on all of the weapon types and such. All of the weapon variants in-game have their base weapon damages. And you can also copy those from spreadsheets, but it's usually faster and easier just to calculate them out from the stats that you can derive from in-game. And once you have input enough for one build, you will get the output, you will get the percentages and such, and then you can use this to compare. And it's handy like this, laid out like this, as you can quickly alter numbers. So if you were to say, for instance, what happens if I go from having 25 total weapon damage because I'm running Obliterate to having 30 amp from running Glass? That's the strength of this. You can just put those numbers in, compare them quickly, and just get a output that way. To actually start filling this in, I'm going to take us to in-game. So actually first I will say, so we're going to, what I usually always do first is calculate base weapon damage. And for this, we need the weapon damage as it is stated in game, and we need our WD and SWD. And with WD is weapon damage, the stat, and SWD is my reference to a specific weapon damage, which is a term that most of us use. Some people use equipped weapon damage, which also works, but that's basically stuff like Fenris and such that basically give to one thing. So Fenris, Sokolov, Araldi, also the stat on the weapon itself basically gives assault rifle weapon damage on assault rifles, for instance. To get this weapon damage number, we're going to jump into game, and we're going to come down here, and this is this weapon damage stat. So you just basically copy this number over. So I'm just going to remember 101639. I'm going to jump over, and I'm going to fill in 101639, and that is that part. Now we need our weapon damage stat and our specific weapon damage stat. If we go back into game, if I scroll down a little bit, we have this section of offense, and here is our all weapon damage bonus. And then in this case, we're going to use an assault rifle, of course, so we're going to also take this assault rifle damage bonus. On the right side here actually is a really handy tool, the breakdown, and here it basically shows what this is all coming from. The only thing that is missing, and that's also the thing that we're going to calculate here, is a grade does not show up here in this breakdown, but it will actually show up in that all weapon damage bonus, as I will show in a second. But here we basically have 100 plus 30. So we have 100 all weapon damage, and we have 30 specific weapon damage. And what I usually do, actually, even with these kind of numbers, is actually I will let the sheet calculate this kind of stuff out for me, as it's easier than trying to do it myself. So I'm going to put in an equal sign, because yeah, it is a spreadsheet, just make use of the tool. 100 plus 30. Now for, of course, 100 plus 30, you wouldn't really need to use this, but let's say you have, I don't know, 89.3 and 22.6, which is not a weird thing to have with an unoptimized build or something that is still missing some points and not everything's optimized to max. Then suddenly this kind of thing becomes very handy. And yeah, you can just equals and then add the numbers together, and that will fill in that field for you. Now, second thing I always do is go get the weapon stats. So in this case, I'm going after RPM, mag size, and base reload. And where we get those from is if I jump us back into game, if I go and select the weapon, here we see the RPM stated, and you want to usually take this number, well, especially if you have the RPM stat. So in this case, we're in a striker build, which specifically is giving increasing our RPM. Quite often you can just take the base RPM, but so for instance, in this case, we would be wrong if we input the base RPM of the FAMAS at 900, because we're getting a rate of fire bonus. So yeah, we have 1035 as our RPM, we have 50 round mag, because we have that mag, of course, the plus 20 mag. And the third number that we need is the reloads, the reload, and that one is stated outright here, so 1.9. I'm going to just remember those numbers, and yeah, you just can take these numbers, especially on reload. I just want to quickly state, so this is a very truncated number, and it's rounded down or up, and we do not know which one it is, but it makes, well, it does make a difference to, of course, sustained DPS. It's too much hassle to get the calculated number out, so we just use this number and just go throw our hands up and go, okay, the sustained DPS is going to be off by a little, but it's easier than trying to calculate out from the base reload of the weapon and then all of your bonuses. As yeah, at most it's going to be off by one full integer, or well, one decimal point in this case. And then, yeah, that we just have to deal with that. So if I jump us back to the sheet, we have 1035 RPM, just fill those in, 50 max size, just fill that in, and 1.9 base reload. I should actually change the terminology of base reload, and you might actually see that already have happened by the time you get to those sheets. And so here we basically have a base weapon damage and the stats of the weapon in here. So we basically have the weapon part in here. We just now need the gear. What I'm going to do here already is go for this base part. The reason these aren't all linked to that base is because sometimes you want to do different weapons and such, and it would be more of a hassle to just have it be wrong than have it be right here. So what I do here is actually select the cell, equals, and then select this cell, and that copies that cell over basically. So I basically say this cell is equal to this cell. If you do not know how a spreadsheet works, just to give that one as well. And we will be using that a lot. So in this case, actually, I'm going to now give everything a name, because usually I do this at first, because then I know which ones I'm going for. So we have SB, Striker's Battle Gear, Obli plus BP, so Obliterate plus Backpack. And I will actually put grade 0, and grade is expertise grade. Some people call it expertise levels, but the term for it is actually expertise grade. I'm going to actually copy those over. So we're going to do the grade at 0. We're going to do the grade at 20, the grade at 21 and the grade at 22. So going to see what grade 20 added, what it cost, well, what it added for that huge cost to go to 21, and also for that huge cost to go to 22, how much it added there. Seeing as I know already that I'm going to do 4 builds, I'm going to actually equals this one already all the way up. So this one, all of them are going to be equal to that top row, so that if I alter something in this top row, then it basically cascades through everything. So this weapon damage plus specific weapon damage we can just copy over because we had it from the build, and all of them will again take it from up there. So now we have reached a crit chance crit damage. I want you to make specific note that we have a coyote in here. So the coyote stats will not show up in our crit chance crit damage. That's just how talents like that work. Talents that go onto the bar of a weapon, or on the bar underneath your ammo counter, basically, those do not show up in your stat sheet. They are buffs, basically. But what we're going to do actually is act as if we've forgotten that, and I'm just going to use that as basically to show how the checking tool works. So in this case, we have 53 crit chance and 141 crit damage, as is stated here. And we're just going to jump on over and go 53 crit chance and 141 crit damage. And I'm again going to equals up the cells underneath it to the one above. And if you don't know, also you can press equals and then select the cell and press enter, and then you go down 1 cell. So that's actually very handy to input it real quickly. So we have, if I jump back again into in-game, we need our headshot stat now. We have 21, or we have 75 headshots, 75 headshot damage. And if we jump back, we're going to put in 75 headshot. We have 25 total weapon damage, and that's going to come from obliterate. Here's, of course, one of the points where we can go, do we want to be obliterate to be at full or at empty? We want it to be at full, but then also to get matching numbers with in-game, we would actually also need to make sure that we actually fill up obliterate before we check our numbers against in-game. So we have obliterate, I know that. We have strikers with a backpack. That's going to be a amp of 100. So it's 100 stacks of 1. And it's not specifically an amp, but it is a multiplier on its own. So it needs its own position to be filled in. And an amp slot is perfectly fine for that. All separate multipliers are basically can be considered an amp. What we have as well is 21 damage. So we're going to shoot an enemy in the health. So we have invulnerable red enemy is what I've prepared here. And that means that we're going to shoot health, and all ARs, as I'll show here as well, of course, have that secondary health damage. So you do need to account for that because we're going to shoot something in health. And also the attributes, so damage to targets out of cover does not show up in your stats sheet, so you just have to be aware of it where you have it and put that in. But that's usually either 10 plus 8 from Fox, or it's just 10 because you have it from your weapon, or it's 12 because you're using an LMG. If we jump back, we're just going to fill those in real quick. 21 damage to health. So here it's damage to health or / damage to armor. Only one is going to be active at a time. So fill in 1. You cannot add your damage to health and damage to armor together because you're damaging 1 at a time. And we had 10 damage to targets out of cover because we do not have a Fox. We only have 10 on the weapon damage. Here we're leaving these last 2 amps empty because we ran out of things. There are no more things for there to be there. I'm going to do the rest with all of these other fields. And yeah, this is the downside, of course, of actually calculating stuff and comparing stuff is, yeah, it does take a second to do stuff like this sometimes. But what we get out of this is always very useful, because here we have all of these 4 builds now completely the same. And actually, just to show it with in-game, so I have the FAMAS equipped that is ungraded, that is grade 0. I'm going to equip this grade 22 weapon. And if we jump back into our stat sheet now, you will see first off that our weapon damage here has gone up, and that is because here, this is where expertise grade feeds into all weapon damage bonus. And as you also can see, it's not in the breakdown in the right side here, just they forgot to add it to here when they added expertise in. But it's fine, we can just take this number from here. So what we have now at grade 22 is 122 plus 30, so we have 152. If we jump back into the sheet, the way that I'm going to do this, so all of these numbers were all equaled to this top number. So what I'm going to actually do instead is C16, which is that cell above it, plus 20 for that grade of 20, plus 21 for a grade of 21, and plus 22 for that grade of 22. And you can see, yeah, we just filled all of those in. Now we can actually test real quick so this is the point once you have all of the stats in, before I actually look at the output and such, is when I usually test it against in-game. And yeah, again, to test it in-game, we're going to use these numbers up here. And the way to do that actually is if I take us in-game, first off, the easiest way is, well, first off, we need to be aware of what we need to be. So we need to be at full stacks of Obliterate, at full stacks of Striker, so we need to be at those numbers before we can actually output it. So for instance, also if you have something like Overwatch or something, for instance, in there for some reason, then yeah, you need to be in cover and have it up to full. Or stuff like Sawyers or something, if you input in those numbers, you basically need to hit the stats that you have input. And one thing that I want to show you as well, if you didn't know as well, if you go into the chat options here in the lower left, as you can see here, I pressed this little breakout button, combat info, damage numbers. Now, every time that I shoot something, you will see that in the chat window, you will have that number pop up there. And that makes it really handy because you can get a number output, a number readout, and then just have it there to compare with, instead of trying to compare it with numbers up there or with damage last hit. Now that we're all set up here, I'm going to actually jump back in here and we'll look at in that section of, so I've swapped back as well to the grade 0 weapon, so we need to look at that row. We need to hit 338K. So I usually truncate it down to Ks, basically. And then quickly look at the other numbers as well, but just for quick comparison. So we need to hit 338K and 815 on a crit. 815K on a crit with body shots. Now we jump back into game. I'm going to first stack Striker up to full. We need to be at full Striker stacks. When Striker is full, I'm going to swap over and fill up Obliterate. And we basically have our number out there. And as you can see, if I bring up the sheet again, we're hitting 815, or we're hitting 338 here on body. Actually, I should show that in game first. So we're hitting 338 on the body shots, 338K, and we're hitting 899 on crit. So if we jump back into the spreadsheet, we can see. So we're hitting this 338. So that part is fine. We're even hitting 338 204 as the specific, as a hard number of the game. And yeah, so that's rounding wise, we're directly correct. But here, if we look at body and crit, we're hitting 899 in game, and we're hitting 815 here. So, and this is basically what this tool is for. We excluded Coyote, as I said before, but Coyote is of course active now. We're shooting at a target range at 5 meters. You can see on the bar underneath my ammo, the Coyote buff is there, and that's giving us 25 crit damage. Now, if we now add in that 25 crit damage by going back into here, so I'm going to take this number and actually use the same method of is or equals 141 plus 25 for the short range buff. So that's 166. And all of a sudden you see this body plus crit number now jumped up to 899. And if we compare that back and go back into game, you can see there's these orange numbers up here, 899, 624. And if we go back in here, you will see that this body shot plus crit is 899622. So we're off by 2, but that's within rounding errors that we would normally get. So we can basically say, okay, at this point we know that the build is basically what I usually call this is validated with in-game stats. So we know that what we've input here matches in game, and that's always the test of any damage calculation, is does it match in game. And that's also how you know, for instance, that what I said of the amp of striker being total weapon damage instead of, or being its own separate multiplier instead of total weapon damage, is in that way because if we, instead of this, so if we take the amp away from there and put 100 total weapon damage, as like the wording implies in game, we see that our numbers would no longer match in game. And that is how we also know these kinds of things of how do we count, like what stat is which, or what talent is which stat, is how you do it like this. You basically put it into the different slots and see what matches in game. And once it matches in game, you know that it is correct, because otherwise you wouldn't match in game. Now I'm going to put that amp back there by going Control Z twice. So now we basically have the burst and the sustained damage numbers of the, because once we have this validated, the burst calculation is very simple. It's just the average shot as it is there, times the RPS. So this RPM divided by 60. So it's a simple calculation. And that way we know the burst DPS now calculation is fine. And we can use this to be the burst DPS of the grade 0 build. Now, of course, this is with 100% headshot accuracy, or, well, first off, 100% accuracy, 100% uptime, and, of course, 100% headshots in this case. If we wanted to not have the headshot number, so all of these are equal together, so what I can do is actually put a 0 here. This is our non-headshot number. This is if we only did body shots. So we have 10 million burst, 6.6 million sustain, and if we keep our, actually I'm just going to Control Z instead of re-inputting it, and if we add in our full headshot as well, we get 15 million.3 burst and 9.2 million sustained DPS. Now, of course, these numbers, and this is going to be its own separate videos, these are theoretical numbers. They're not even simulations, they're calculations. So they're even simplified from being an actual simulation. And they are quite valuable still. You can use them to actually ascertain a lot about some builds, especially for instance, as I showed with that Fox in the Obliterate Striker video, why you shouldn't go Fox, basically, is calculations like that. The only places where you have to be very aware is the second that you start basically going inter-build. So something like a glass red doesn't need to stack. So that is at its full damage at its start versus a striker that needs to stack. So now the two builds don't play exactly the same. And then you have to basically also be cognizant of that. You have to basically factor those kinds of things in. And those are all basically opinions at that point. But what we can say is that this build does this amount of burst DPS, and especially with something like Great. So the only difference between these four builds here is the FAMAS that is being used. It has a more higher grade, expertise grade on the weapon itself. So in this case, you can see that going from grade 0 to grade 20 is giving us 8.7% extra damage output just from having a FAMAS that is grade 20. And yeah, that is at the cost of 55 exo components. That's what it costs to go from, well, weapon grade 11 to weapon grade 20 is 55 exo components. Now going from 20 to 21, we can see that this is an increase of 0.43%. And that one costs a further 20 exocomponents. Going from 20 to 21 is 20 exocomponents. And currently it's also 20 exocomponents to go from 21 to 22. So, this increase is 0.44%. So a little bit less even. And that is also, yeah, how weapon damage works. But yeah, you can see going from 0 to 20 is actually, yeah, it is a bump, especially even in this build, especially where it's also red cored. So the less red cores you have, the bigger this value will be. So for instance, if we compare this, instead of having 130 as we have there, if we were, say, on a PvP build that has only 45, you can see these numbers went up by quite a lot. And now, of course, this is not what this build is, and of course the other stats also matter, and now the burst and stuff is incorrect and stuff. But this is why filling in it in this sheet instead of trying to calculate it out by in-game or something, or taking your weapon damages, is stuff like that. You can easily change a stat and see what it does. It lets you play around a lot easier. So if I'm going to Control Z back and go back to the build as it is, basically, we can see, yeah, that going from, so this is that number that I had before at grade 21. That's why I said it's around 9%, it's 9 point something percent extra. That's how I get these kinds of numbers. And you can as well now, by understanding this. And that's the strength of these. You can use it to compare. So for instance, as well, I can go that, oh, I gained 8.7% for those 55 exos. A further 40 exos gave me less than 1%. So was it worth it? No, but I already knew that before I made the decision. But that FAMAS is my little baby, and I will upgrade it always to the max that is available. But yeah, this is kind of what is useful about these kinds of tools, is you can use them to make decisions. And as you can see here, they basically show that, okay, if we have this, we can get this increase. So for instance, now as well, instead of, so for instance, in the slot that is 20, I'm going to change that to 10 instead. And we can see at 10, grade 10, we already have 4.3%, or actually even another number that is handy, around expertise level 14 is where it like starts to get harder. So what do we have at expertise level 14? We already have 6% of the damage increase. So we have 3% left going all the way, or well, a little bit over 3% left if we go all the way to the max of grade 22. But you can see that basically in those first 14 is actually where like the big chunk of the increase already is. Now if we take all of those stats back, so this is the sheet as it is. One thing I will actually also show is that you can quickly take this base section for the base weapon damage. If you have multiple weapons, you just copy and paste it over. And so for instance, if I were to say, if I take us back to in-game, I'm going to equip, let's say, a Carbine 7, and I'm going to go into the weapon stats of it. So we have 108, 127, 108, 127. I'm going to take us back into here, and I'm going to do 108, 127, enter. It didn't take input. 108, 127, enter. Our weapon damage and specific weapon damage is the same still. So this is the base of Carbine 7, which I know already is correct, which is 47,012 is the base of Carbine 7. And if you wanted to compare weapons and such as well, you could do it this way. You basically take some of the cells. So if we were to add one more, basically we would go from there. And but you would also need to change the RPM for the builds that have that, and you can do that just here. So instead of these are all equals down to this cell down here, instead of that you just put in a hard number of 790 for the Carbine 7, for instance. But I'm going to delete that and leave this as it is here, and this will be linked as is here. And in a second, I will return for the talent calculation. And here is the weapon talent sheet. So what we're going to fill in here is, as you can basically see, it's somewhat of the same layout. It's somewhat different that only one line is here yellow. And this is also just because it is basically for one build. You input the stats of one build and it spits out talents, weapon talents. In my opinion, the more popular weapon talents out as damage numbers. And you also here do still get burst DPS, sustained DPS, but here also you get damage per mag output, which is an important stat actually, so it's worthwhile. And it's the same layout for the rest of it. In the upper left, in this section up here, you get all of your outputs with percentages and stuff. This is again in the same way with the other sheet. A checking tool, basically, you can, as it also states on here, so these numbers have to match in-game. And again, we input fields of weapon stats, of RPM, max size, and reload, and then we put in a weapon damage, stated weapon damage from the in-game stat sheet. And then we input all of our stats again as well. So here, actually, I'm going to use the stats from the grade 22 weapon, just to take those ones. If I jump us over into game, we see that that has a weapon damage of 111,362. I'm going to jump us back into the sheet and 111,362. And that is our weapon damage there. I'm going to take again our stats from in-game for the weapon, RPM of 1035, a mag of 50, and our reload speed again here as 1.9 seconds. So we're going to jump back again and 1035, max size of 50, and a reload of 1.9. So that has that filled in. Now we just need the stats again from our in-game, and we're going to do the same dance as the last one. We have the all weapon damage bonus here. We have the assault rifle bonus here. And those two together are 152. I'm not going to use the sheet to calculate it this time, but actually input it myself. I'll show again actually still stat by stat, where if we jump back up here, we have 53 crit chance and 141 crit damage. But this is the build. And again, we have, as you can see on underneath my ammo, Coyote is active at 0 to 15. So we have another 25 crit damage there, as we already found out with the other calculation. To get it to match, we need to also input that. So if we again go back here, so we have 53 crit chance, we have 166 crit damage. I'm going to leave out headshot damage because I want to have the body shot numbers. And basically here, if you want to have headshot numbers, you input headshot. If you don't want to get headshot numbers, you leave out headshot. In the same way that if you want damage to armor numbers, you input damage to armor value. If you want damage to health number, you input damage to health value. And that's just done for simplicity. It's easier for you to just fill it or not fill it in the way that you need it, than to actually split this out into having two different output charts with headshot, without headshot. And simplicity is actually, one of the goals of this. This is basically as simple as I could make it, basically, without going too far and making it not as useful. We have 25 total weapon damage and 100 amp, and those two come from our talent. So again, if I jump back into game, so the 25 total weapon damage is coming from obliterate at full stacks. So we're going to again consider it as at full stacks. The 100 amp is coming from strikers, and again, it is the same wording, and incorrectly so. So this is actually its own separate multiplier, and that's why we deal with it as an amp, basically. So it is 100 stacks of with the backpack 1%. So 100 additive stacks of 1, and that means that it's 100 amp is what I'm going to use it as amp and multiplier as basically the same connotations here. So here we need DTH or DTA. So for this whole test, we've done DTH already, so let's keep it the same. And we have that 21 DTH and 10 DT damage to targets out of cover, and those both, of course, just come from our weapon. As I'll jump back over here, yeah. So that's this 21 damage to health and 10 damage to targets out of cover. As we do not have a fox, of course, or anything, so yeah, that is all of the damage to targets out of cover that we have. If I jump back again, I will just quickly have a look if everything looks okay. So I know that this is the base of a FAMAS, so 44191. So at least this number and the weapon damage numbers are all correct. The rest of it all looks pretty okay. One thing we can actually do here is we have this 370k and 985. What I actually can do quickly is compare them to here, 370k and 985. Those two match these numbers here. So actually, let's check them as well against the in-game numbers. And to do that, of course, I will need to stack Striker back to full. I'm going to actually move my chat back to the end so that it actually tracks the last numbers again. So I'm going to fill up both Strikers and Obliterate. Just going to unload a little bit, and we have some numbers at the bottom here. So 370 and 980. If I actually here we have higher numbers. So yeah, we lost some stacks somewhere. But here actually, yeah, so 370, 556. And if I jump back this sheet and use this screen, 370, 556 in game, 557 here, rounding, that's within parameters of rounding. And if we jump back in here, we have a crit damage of 985, 678, 985, 678. So we have we're off by 4. 985,682 is stated here, but that's within rounding errors of especially Striker. A Striker is a super high DPS set, and as such, it basically compounds rounding errors to be larger and larger numbers. But being within 4 is fine. Usually, if something would be wrong, we would be off by several thousands. So we know, basically have validated that this build matches with the in-game numbers as they are given from the range. And you can just use the range for this as well. Never use the DPS numbers of the range or something, but what you can do is actually use it just to get damage numbers, as they, to my knowledge, always still match up to all content, basically. There's no content that gives different damage values. Now that we have the stats, we know we filled them in, everything, we have validated it. We know that we can now basically go look at our stats and basically get our treat of what we output. So if we look at the talents, you can see basically they're laid out in what used to be the recommended stats or talents as they were. So first off, we have no talent, and these numbers still, of course, match that other one, and this could be, you can use this to also compare if you're running stuff like preservation or something. It's not that there is no talent, it's that it's not a damage talent. Then we can see that with fast hands, what we get is absolutely no increase in damage per mag, absolutely no increase in burst DPS, as it's a reload speed talent, but what we do get is a huge increase in our sustained DPS. And this is what you use fast hands for. Fast hands only adds to sustained DPS. It never adds to any of the others because, yeah, reload speed isn't in the other calculations at all. So what we can see as well here is that with most of the other ones, they increase flatly over all of them. So the strained or in sync, for instance, here is the same over all of them. Same here for all of the other ones as well. But one thing to keep specific note of is you see that 3 of these talents are in red here. And that's just to signify that they cannot be used directly as DPS, especially in burst. So what the sustained DPS with a talent like Strained does match up because we aren't, we're averaging out basically towards each second is getting averaged out basically. But with burst, you cannot say the same. because burst DPS, these talents are not linear. So in actual existence, their first second of burst DPS output is different than their second of burst DPS output. And while this does represent an averaging out of the burst DPS, it isn't completely, you can't correlate it one-to-one, because of course strained, for instance, stacks up. Same for optimist, it stacks up to be more and more increase, so it isn't linear. And that means that I just signify that with this red around here. It doesn't mean that they're completely wrong. It doesn't mean that this isn't useful info. It just means that you have to be aware of it. This is also the reason that if I actually scroll down a little bit in this right side here, I have listed the important limitations. There are even more than these, but these ones are the important limitations of this. As yes, we are simplifying stuff. These aren't even simulations or something. These are calculations. They're super simplified variants of what we get in game, basically. So while the data is still very valuable and very useful, you just have to be aware how it applies. To actually move into in sync, we see that it gives 30 weapon damage, so it is actually a lot. In actual play, or in actual numbers, it's giving close to 12%, because of course also we have a ton of weapon damage. And here as well, we see strained is at 108%. It's giving 8% increase to our output. And that is also because we are at 53 crit chance. Strained actually works even better if it's, of course, 60 crit chance here. So the mid-range buff of Coyotes actually improves strained even more. And again, to further go down here, we even are impacting Optimist more because we are a grade 22 weapon. So here, Optimist is even lower than it was before, when we had grade 30 or grade 0 weapon with the previous calculation sheet that I showed in the Obliterate Striker video. So so Optimist gets impacted a lot. So a lot of people, again, believe that RPM or something matters between these two. That's absolutely not the case. What Strain really cares about is that it has that you have high crit chance, and that the RPM isn't insanely high. And insanely high, we're talking about 1200 plus. So if you had a vector or something, then these numbers might match up, but we aren't. Even with the FAMAS on Striker, Strained is still winning. And what Optimus really cares about is that you have as few weapon damage, basically, as you can have. So especially on a build like this, where we are all red cores and all we have a grade 22 adding even more to it, we're diminishing the returns of weapon damage quite a lot, and Optimist is weapon damage, so it is getting diminished and it's giving less returns per point. So yeah, Strained beats it out. So Strained, and that's why that recommendation comes of do fast hands as a generalist use. If you prefer to have a damage talent, you can do Strained on Striker. And Flatline works well as well. As you can see here, Flatline is basically a 15%. It's an amp. It's basically getting calculated into it as a 15% increase. Same for, we call these the status talents, status eyeless ignited. They're just flat 20% and 25% on their perfect variants. And Ranger, I've put in 3 different ranges at 5 meters, at 15 and 25. And of course, they're just 2% per 5 meters. So they're a really easy calculation. But especially, you can from here go, especially for instance, if you were to fill in a PvP build. So if we were to take, for instance, this and make this, let's say, instead of 152 weapon damage, we had 45. We input a lot of blue cores, for instance. And actually, this would be 45 plus 22, but just for comparison's sake, we can now see that Optimist does beat Strain. So Optimist really cares, and Strain didn't change at all. And that's the thing. Optimist really, really cares about how much weapon damage you have on the build already. So in red builds that we run for PvE a lot, Optimist isn't usually the best choice. Strength usually wins out. And also make note of how much in sync has actually increased as well, because also that one is based off of weapon damage. And that's the use for these sheets a lot. So for instance, you saw me swap our weapon damages down and such. And that is really handy. So you can kind of see like, okay, if I go 1 core less, does a different talent become better? If I put 1 core more, red core more, does a talent become different? And that's the use of these. So you can easily swap out numbers. So for instance, I put in Unbreakable. I can just change that total weapon damage to 0 or just delete it and be 0. And now I can see that it didn't impact much of the numbers except measured, because measured does care about total weapon damage. But especially here, we would see also that the numbers actually went down by quite a lot. And the multi-calc, of course, is handier to just compare multiple builds like this. So, but even in this one, you can kind of easily just change some numbers around and see what the outcome is of them. And again, here's also a short written guide as well at the bottom of this one, and a picture as well of how to where to get these stats from, which is basically what this video was as well. And yeah, I hope you actually found this informative, and hopefully you now know how to use these sheets, and especially the Multicalc is a very strong tool. As you can see, it's very handy to just compare builds together. Just be aware that what you're comparing, that it's of the same note, or that you are personally aware that maybe you are, if you, for instance, compare a Hunter's Fury build versus a Striker's build, they play completely differently. So their damages aren't directly comparable, but they can still give you information to work off of, to know what is better build or not. And especially for if you're just want to know what happens if I swap in a Grupo piece for a Fenris piece, this kind of thing, well, you put in the numbers of the Grupo one, then you put in the numbers of the Fenris one, and you get a percentage out of it, better percentage on, in that case, basically the same build is better. For instance, especially what I showed with Fox's Prayer. Yeah, the Fox's Prayer is just worse, and it plays the exact same, so we can just say it is worse. And yes, as always, all of these will be linked. I will also link to these ones specifically, so you can just look at them as well and copy them from here as well. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I will likely do a build showcase as my next video for a little build that I used to run quite a lot in the format, and is a more of a off-meta build again. And I hope to see you for that one. Have a good night.